Now I want to turn this over to Peter Lin, who is an orchid specialist who is joining us from California. Peter's, he's one of those people that gets into these kind of thing. He's a collector. That tends to be the mindset of the people who enjoy doing this kind of thing, that variety and variation. He's got over 1,000 plants. He's a judge for the American Orchid Society. He speaks on a lot of topics on orchids, and I'm really pleased that he's going to join us to talk a little bit about Fukiran and those orchids, because it's something I need to learn. So welcome.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. I'll start by sharing my screen. Okay, hopefully everybody can see the title slide. My program is titled Neofinettia and the Japanese Fukiran. So what I'm going to review today is I'm going to give you a brief history of Neofinettia falcata. I'll look at the color forms of the flowers. We'll look at flower forms or flower shapes, leaf forms, and then I'll talk about the exhibition of Neofinettia primarily in Japan. I'll talk about culture, and then at the end, I'll stop sharing the program and we can have a time for question and answers. So the history of Neofinettia. The earliest writings date to the early 1600s. So this is an orchid genus that has been grown for many, many years, probably longer than other types of orchids. It is native to Japan, Okinawa, and into China and Korea. The titles of Furan versus Fukiran. So Furan is the English name for Neofinettias, and Furan in Japanese is translated as wind orchid. And that is because the Neofinettias are epiphytes. They grow on trees and tree branches, and there's a lot of wind and air circulation, so they're called Furan. Now, back in the 1600s, the Japanese samurai warlords took a fancy to the Furan and had their people look for special varieties of Furan, and they termed them as Fukiran, and that is loosely translated as orchids for the rich and noble. So that's where the origins of the Fukiran came about. Now, there are many criteria for Fukiran. The Japanese look at all the details of the plant, not just the flowers, primarily the leaves, the leaf shape, the leaf coloration, down to the roots and the presentation of the Fukiran. And we'll talk about that a little bit later down in the program. The availability of Fukiran. So these plants have been grown for hundreds of years, and the availability of the Fukiran was very limited because the Japanese were not really interested in exporting their prized orchids. And it wasn't about 15 years ago that people started coming to the US to sell the Fukiran varieties. This is an early painting of what the Neofinettias or the Fukiran were shown. They are shown on a moss mound and displayed in an attractive pot with a stand. This is a modern representation of what you might have seen back in the old days, a handcrafted pot. That wire cage is a replica of what was probably back then in gold or copper. And that was to protect the plant because, as I said, these plants were collected by the noblemen of Japan. And if you were just a peasant, you probably couldn't even look upon these plants. The Nihon Fukiran Kai was developed or created in the 1940s, and that is the Japan Fukiran Society. There have been Fukiran exhibitions that have been held annually since 1949. They are held in various cities in Japan, and they are They hold a judging and exhibition. I've had the pleasure of visiting the show 2 times now. It would have been a third time this year in 2020. However, due to the COVID virus, all the events were canceled in Japan. Mark already mentioned the Fukiran Meikan chart, and that is updated yearly, and that also has been in existence for over 70 years. And we'll look at that in depth a little later in the program. So looking at the color forms of Neofinettia, my first slide is just what you might have seen in situ in Japan. This is a large ginkgo tree, and you can see the branches are covered with Neofinettia facata. Here's a little bit closer up. They grow as a monopodial epiphyte, forming a fan, and then as the plant grows, it forms multiple fans. So you can see that the tree branch is covered with many, many plants. Now, the charm of this plant is that it flowers in the summer, usually anywhere from May to July. The flowers are very, very fragrant, and that is a delight for orchid growers. They're primarily fragrant at night. They're pollinated by nocturnal moths, and so the fragrance is reminiscent of jasmine, gardenia, vanilla, and coconut. So here's the type species. It is white. The flowers are gracefully reflexed, and they all have a nectary or spur attached to the lip. Now they average usually 4 to 6 flowers per spike. However, I've seen them with as many as 12 flowers on a single spike. Each fan can produce 2 to 3 spikes. There is a form of the species from the Ryukyu Islands in Japan. It is called the Amami Island form, and it is close to 50% larger in both the flowers and the plant size. So it's just a larger version of the type species. There are some color forms that exist in nature. The first one is the pink or magenta spurred variety, and this is it here. Now the Japanese give all of their varieties a Japanese name. This is variety Shuteno. This is another variety called Toyazakura. Green flowers. This is variety Hisui. Pale green flowers with a white lip. Yellow. Now, there truly isn't a yellow variety that occurs in nature. The only one that might be considered yellow is variety Zuin. It has kind of a creamy with a little bit of a yellow blush. However, the deeply colored yellow varieties shown here, Kibana, are probably hybrids. There is some hybrid influence that creates the yellow color. However, the plant and the flowers does resemble the species very much so. Now, the Japanese, because it is a hybrid, does not consider this a Fukiran, but it is still very popular and grown with the collectors. This is another selection that was cloned. This is Golden Dragon. Very deep yellow flowers. Some other color varieties. These are all, again, primarily hybrids. This is variety Yubai, and it's a cross between the yellow Kibana and the pink Shuteno. So here we have yellow flowers with pink spurs. This is variety Koyu, and you can see a solid pink flower indicating that there is some hybrid influence. One of my favorites is Beni Kuroi, also probably has some hybrid influence. Now there are probably hundreds of other flower colors and hybrids that are existing out there. Unfortunately, the breeders do not usually mention the parents, so we do not know what the hybrid origin is. We just know that they're hybrids. Now, different flower forms exist in this one species as well. This first one is what I just loosely called multi-segment, and this is variety Engei. And you can see the flower shape is very different than the type species. Bean leaf, the flowers here are a little bit stockier and a little bit wider. They tend to be upward facing as well. This is Tomokongo. Forward spur, variety tension. So here the spur, instead of coming behind the lip, is in front of the lip. Polaric flowers. So this is Hoshiguruma. Here you see the lip has mutated into a petal. It does not have a spur. Triple spur. These varieties are very, very popular with collectors. Here we have 3 lips and 3 spurs and no petals. Now they've done some breeding with this particular variety, and in so doing have created pink varieties and even yellow 3-spurred varieties. This is Mangekko, showing you the pink spurs with 3 lips. Okay, so now we go on to the leaf forms. Many, many varieties of leaf forms exist, mainly in terms of variegation, but also shape and size of the leaf as well. The first one is the marginal variegation. This is Iojiku Fugaku, and you can see the yellow margins on the leaf. Tenkei Fukiran, tricolor variegation. This is Hokage, green, yellow, and pink. Tiger variegation is either randomly spotted or blotched with yellow or white. Here we have Byako and Kara Nishiki. Sometimes they can be almost entirely yellow. Sometimes people think that the plants are sick, but they are just naturally variegated that way. Inner variegation, Akobono. The center of the leaf has a yellow margin to it. Pine needle. These tend to be very compact, small growers, and the leaves are shaped like pine needles. I find that these varieties are very shy bloomers. I've had a plant of this variety for about 6-7 years, and it only bloomed once during those 6 or 7 years with just 1 or 2 flowers. The bean leaf, this is Tomokongo. You can see the leaves are a little wider, shorter, and stockier. There are some miniature bean leaves as well. This is Kiro Sinju. The entire fan is about 1.5 inches wide. Rarest of the Neofinetias. This is a variegated bean leaf. I found this on a Japanese auction site for 1.2 million. Our yen, so not as expensive as you might think. However, 1.2 million yen is about $11,600. Needless to say, I did not bid on this particular plant, and I'm not sure if it sold. But the variegated bean leaves are extremely rare. Out of a seedling population, you might have 1 out of 1,000 plants that might exhibit the variegation. They also tend to be very slow growers, so they're very, very expensive. And I'll touch upon a couple of these a little bit later on. Exhibition of Neofinettia and judging criteria. So this is a picture from my friend Engei, who talked earlier in the program. And this shows you many, many parts of the plant and the pot. I'll touch upon just a few of these. The first one is Engei, and that is where the leaf joins the stem. And the Japanese pay an extreme amount of detail to the plant and the presentation, just like bonsai, where there's meticulous detail. So the Engei can vary in the shape of where the leaf joins the stem. There's ocean wave, there's flat, and then there's mountain Engei. And the mountain Engei has a little wavy pattern shaped like a mountain, and that is the most desirable of the Engei types. Root tips. So here we see the tip of the root can be colored from white to green to what we call mud, and then to ruby red. This particular plant is showing the ruby red tips, which again is the most desirable. And so in the presentation of the Neofinetias, oftentimes you will see the root tips exposed, and that is very desirable. The Japanese present their plants on sphagnum moss mounds, and this is again to show the beauty of the plant and the presentation. Again, the roots, the root tips are typically can be exposed to show the color, and the plant is positioned at the top of the mound. Mark already mentioned the pot. The pot is typically a three-legged pot, as you see here, and it's usually handcrafted, hand-painted, and oftentimes can be very, very expensive. And I'll show some examples of pots a little later on in the program. So the plant in totality is presented in the handcrafted pot on a coaster, or which can be made out of wood or bamboo, or on a platform. Mark also mentioned the Fukiran Meikan chart, and he did a great job of explaining some of this, and I'll go through and touch upon some of this as well. He mentioned the three pillars that are on the left, center, and right. That's the Sanbon Bashira. The gold boxes show the excellence varieties, and then the white boxes show the all popular. On the very left are 3 spaces for new varieties of Fukiran. Now there is a particular process to get a new variety registered in Japan. It requires 3 plants of the same variety to be shown, and that is because they want to make sure that any of the characteristics of the plant are stable and not just a one-off variegation or mutation. Also, there is a sort of hefty entrance or application fee to be able to apply for registration. And then if you're lucky enough to be registered, it appears on the chart on the left the first year, and then the subsequent years it will move down to other parts of the chart. Now there is an English translation of the chart done by Ernie Shin, and that can be found on the Facebook Neofinettia group, which I can supply a little later on. And he does a great job of explaining the chart and translating the Japanese kanji into Romanized English. So these are the Romanized names of the varieties on the chart. And this is where the westernized collectors can truly look and reference the different varieties. So the first one is Fukiran, which has been on the chart for, probably since the beginning. And the next section shows you the all popular. Now I'll go through the excellence varieties next, just to give you an idea of what they look like. So the first one is Fukiran. That's considered the king of the Fukiran. And as I mentioned, it has been in the chart for so many years. This particular variety typically sells for about $1,000 per fan. Now, the prices have come down in recent years as the popularity and demand for these have come about. So now you can buy a Fukiran single fan for about $500. Now, you might ask why they are so expensive. The Neofinettia varieties are typically divisions, are only grown as divisions. They do not, the marginal variegation varieties typically do not come true from seed, so they are, again, grown by division. Some of the heavily variegated varieties are very slow growing as well. So in order to divide your plant, it can take a number of years. But you can imagine some of these varieties have been grown for hundreds of years. The next one is kin botan. This is an extremely desirable plant. The botan type of variegation is the newer leaves exhibit the yellow variegation, and then they slowly turn green later on as the leaf matures. Kin botan regularly sells for at least $1,000 per fan, even to this day. Next, on the left, we have Yokihime. On the right, Keiga, Umarushima. These typically are in the $500 to $600 per fan. Mengetsu is very close to Fukiran. And then Suiho. Suiho is also very desirable and still fairly rare. It typically sells for about $1,000 per fan. Suisen is a bean leaf, and then Himiko is what we call a sword leaf. You can see the leaves have an attractive curve to them, and they have a particular look to them, resembling a sword shape. Okay, so I've had the pleasure of visiting the Japan Fukiran show twice now. This was back in 2018, the 69th show. So they've had shows since 1949. This is the award table showing you the trophies and the names attached to each variety. These are some examples of the plants that are shown at the exhibition. On the left, we have Nishikori. On the right, we have a bean leaf that is showing you Sumi variegation. Those dark purple blotches are Sumi. Now, typically at the shows, we see very large plants with multiple fans. On the left, Kyokusho, showing you the tiger variegation. And then Kogen Nishiki on the right also has the tiger variegation. On the left is Sekai, very popular variety, showing you a kind of a curved bean leaf. This one happens to be in flower. As you might have noticed, the plants exhibited usually do not have flowers, and that is because the Japanese really focus on the other parts of the plant, the leaves, the variegation, and then the presentation of the plant itself. There is actually another show that occurs in July, which is a flowering Neofinettia show. The one on the right is extremely rare. This is Sekai Tora. Tora is showing you the tiger variegation of the plant. Now here we have two variegated bean leaves. And I mentioned that these can be very expensive. They are very rare, very slow growing as well. Typically, these sell for $10,000 to $15,000 per fan. For this year, this is the grand champion, Fukiran. And I might have mentioned that each fan is about $500 or $600. So there's probably close to 25 or 30 fans. So I think you can do the math that this is an extremely expensive plant. But one of the fun things about this show is it's a 2-day show, and at the end of the 2 days, they hold an auction of plants. The plants are submitted by the members of the Fukiran Society, and there's usually probably 200 to 300 plants that are auctioned off. This particular year, the auction total was about $250,000, and everything is paid in cash at this particular event. So you pretty much need to take a wad of cash to be able to participate in this event. Now, only members can participate in the auction. However, I was able to bid on a plant from a friend who is a member. Now, we do have an American exhibition in judging in the same Japanese style. So about 10 years ago, we formed the Fukiran Society of America, and we try and do the same type of exhibition with the same type of presentation as the Japanese do. And this is one of our events where we show the award winners. This is typically held in Santa Barbara, California. And our judges are usually Jason Fisher from Minnesota, and also Satomi's father comes from Japan, who is actually a board member of the Japan Fukiran Society. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about culture. So where can you grow these plants? These plants are very temperature tolerant, so they can withstand temperatures down to 32 degrees. It can actually snow in its native habitat. And then I've had temperatures up to 110, and they seem to grow fine in that temperature range. Now, in California, I'm able to grow them outside all year round. However, there are those that grow them in greenhouses or even indoors under lights. So light-wise, they are medium light loving orchids. So you do need a good amount of light. However, shade cloth is recommended if you grow in a full sun area. I already mentioned the temperature range. They tolerate a wide variety of temperature. However, probably 40 to 90 degrees is a good range of temperature. In Japan, they do experience quite a bit of humidity and good air circulation. In Japan, the rains primarily in the summertime, and then in the winter they are fairly dry. So water-wise, we typically water them generously in the spring, summer, and then in fall and winter we tend to hold back on the water as they really slow down in the winter, almost becoming semi-dormant. Potting medium in pots. So the traditional method of growing Neofinettia is in sphagnum moss, New Zealand sphagnum moss, and clay pots. However, they will grow in just about anything that other orchids grow in. So a bark mix or rock mix, plastic pots, they will grow fine there. However, if you want to be growing them in the Japanese tradition, you would use moss and clay pots. So this is the example of the New Zealand sphagnum moss that they use for growing these plants. Typically, we use what we call grade 3A up to 5A type moss. The higher qualities of moss usually have longer strands and more fluffy moss strands. So the basic pots are shown here. The Japanese do not typically grow them in the exhibition pots, which can be quite expensive, but these are just clay pots that are reminiscent of the handcrafted pots. Prior to a show, they are typically remossed and then repotted into the exhibition pots. So these are examples of the exhibition pots. Typically they have 3 legs or a rounded base. They are always handcrafted and hand painted. The one on the top right is a chino pot. Chino is a potter in Japan, and I was able to see him at the show, and it's very interesting with this particular potter. His pots are in extreme demand. They typically start off at about $1,000 per pot, and higher than that, of course. And it was funny because at the show, he had a booth, but he had no pots for sale. He only had pots that were reserved in advance. You basically have to be in a waiting line to reserve one of his pots. Now, Hiroshige also mentioned there's a potter in the US that makes these pots as well. Her name is Carol Helen Buell, and she has a website. She's been working on the Japanese style of pots here. Now, at the last show in Japan, I had the pleasure of visiting the president of the Japanese Fukiran Society, and this is him here. And he was graciously showing his collection to us, and also he showed us how they repot the Neofinettia into the moss mound. They are experts at that. You know, as beginners, it can take us 10 to 15 minutes to moss a plant, but he could moss a plant within 3 or 4 minutes. This is his greenhouse, showing you just the Neofinetias that are grown in the greenhouse. They're grown in these wire hangers on the top and then on benches as well. You can see that they're grown in the basic pot, clay pots, and they're all in stands that lift them away from the bench, creating a great amount of air circulation. Now, each of the pots has a very large drainage hole. So what you don't see in the moss mound is that there is actually a hole underneath the moss mound. It is not a solid mound. And that is so that the moss will dry out between watering and the roots have access to air and dryness. If you want to learn more, as I mentioned, we have a Fukiran Society of America. Our website is fukiransoa.com, and there you will learn a lot about the Fukiran. There have been several books on Fukiran. However, they're primarily all in Japanese. Some of the books do have the Romanized names of the varieties, so at least you can identify the varieties in English. I have a website, diamondorchids.com, and then also if you would like to email me, my email is lynn.petert@yahoo.com. If you have any other questions you might want to ask me after the program. I will stop sharing the screen and I'll take a look at the question and answers here.
Peter?
Yeah.
I'll help you out with some of the questions so you can
Okay.
on answering. So there was a comment, all the participants in the events shown appear to be male. Is this a men's only tradition in Japan?
Yeah, very interesting. There were some female at the show, but it seems to be primarily men that are the members of the society. I'm not sure if there was even a female judge. I think they were all men.
How about, this is a question about culture, fertilizer. What do you do in terms of fertilizing plants?
Yeah, they do like some fertilizer during the active growing period. So I use just a general orchid fertilizer that I mix into the water. And I try and fertilize them with every watering. However, you know, sometimes you get lazy and don't do that. But they're not typically heavy feeders, but I do try and give them some fertilizer.
Okay. There was also a question over on the chat, which I'll ask you, and you can get into as much taxonomy as you want. Although I will say the first thing I learned with your talk was Neofinettia rather than Neofinettia. But there's a question, are these different than the Vandas in the US, which are hung with exposed roots and never potted?
Yeah, you know, technically they have been moved to Vanda, which I don't know if the Japanese really even accept that because that's their treasured orchid, you know, and for the taxonomists to move it to Vanda is probably a travesty. But they're similar to the Vandas. However, they don't require as much light as the large growing Vandas. And typically we don't grow them in open baskets with all the roots exposed. But you can do that if you want, but we don't do that.
So you mentioned with the yellow one, you said that was hybridized. Are you
Mhm.
talking about hybridized with another species
Mhm.
or varieties that were hybridized? Where are some of these different traits coming from other than the natural variation?
Yeah, it would have to be probably what were formerly known as ascocentrums. And there's Ascocentrum garriae or miniatum that is yellow in color. And they've actually done a lot of breeding with other members of the Vanda Alliance. And in so doing, they've actually created yellow varieties that are very similar to the yellow Neofinetias, showing you that there is probably some influence of an Ascocentrum in the background. They back cross them back and forth, so after several generations, you regain the look of the species, but with the color of the other parent.
Okay. Well, if the Fukiran Society is ever interested in East Coast show, they have to let us know. We'd love to host people. I don't know how many of the growers are people who are growing them out this way, but it would be a fascinating thing to put on here. I'd
Yeah.
love to do it. I want to emphasize to our audience, if you have questions for Peter, ask them now, or you're going to have to email him because I believe Peter's going to have to leave us before we finish up. So you won't be able to ask questions at the end. And speaking for myself, I'm not going to be able to answer most of those. And not sure how much Ozzy will be able to answer them either. So do make sure you ask any questions now or email him. And I want to also echo what Peter said about the resource that is that the Fukiran Society website. That is where I found a lot of the information that I was looking for. And I'm pretty sure that's where I found Matsuoka's website listed as an additional resource. And that had a lot of great in detailed explanations going on it. Somebody asked if they can have the website for the pots. Are you talking about the very showy pots or the clay pots for growing? If you want to type that in, we'll try and answer. The showy pot, that was White House. I can't remember now. Arlene, do you remember? We saw the video, the Betsoka's video earlier, and he showed those pots. We both went to look at it, and her imperfect pots were out of my price range. The ones that were not imperfect were well out of my price range. Let me see if I can pull it up. Might still have it in my search.
Yeah, it's firsthousefurnishings.com.
First House Furnishings. I always want to say White House. First House Furnishings.
.com. She's a good friend of mine. She actually lives here in California. She's been making those pots for a number of years. It takes an extreme amount of work to make those. They're all hand painted, hand fired, and everything. So,
Oh, and they're beautiful. They're
yeah.
beautiful. And these names come up again and again. Peter mentioned Matsuoka, of course, who gave our introductory piece, and Ernie Shin. Peter and Ernie were some of the people that when I reached out feelers to my contacts, they were the people who said, get in touch with these guys. They're the ones who can talk intelligently about this and knowledgeably. So I really do appreciate you sharing this with us. I just find it all fascinating. And there are some videos I found showing some Japanese, so it's hard you can't follow what they're saying, but showing some of the technique of mossing. And I mean, it's tweezers and get it wrapped around and it's perfect. I tried to do it with a couple of plants just to stage a photo, and it's the shaggy ball, and theirs is this perfect thing. It's a real skill. Everything about the process is pretty interesting to me.